Good afternoon. My name is Eli Howes. Can you please tell me your full name?
My name is Joseph David Scarangella.
This is Joe. He's an ex-examiner, he's worked for the British Council and IDP, and has a Delta, which is a pretty big deal in the language teaching world. I found him after italki got in contact with me a couple of weeks ago to sponsor one of my YouTube lessons. Let me tell you a bit about what happened. I went on italki to try and find a teacher I could do a video with. For those of you that don't know, italki is a platform to find language tutors. So I selected English, although I was tempted to brush up on my Spanish. I selected test preparation, IELTS. You can also select by the times that you were available. I didn't care what their first language was or where they were from, but you can select to have only native speakers if you want. Finally, I looked at the price. Now, it's great the way that italki lets you select based on your budget. There's no monthly subscription. You just pay for the lesson you want and you can have one-to-one lessons for as low as $5. Anyway, I put £20 and checked out which teachers were available. I watched a few teacher introductions. However, when I found Joe, I knew that he was the right one for me. He's an ex-examiner, Delta qualified from Canada, and has over 20 years experience. Also, I felt from his intro video that we'd get along quite well, so I booked the lesson. Now, if you find a teacher that you like, use the promo code PRO5 to get a free $5 when you spend your first 10. So this means you pay $10 and get $15 learning credits. Now, that will only be available to the first 50 people that sign up, so if you're interested, be quick. Anyway, let's watch the speaking test with me and Joe.
Good afternoon. My name is Eli Howes. Can you please tell me your full name?
My name is Joseph David Scarangella.
And what should I call you?
You can just call me Joe.
Notice how Joe presents himself. He is calm, relaxed, and attentive. A good idea is to think of the examiner as a teacher that you know well. Be friendly and polite, but not too formal. I also like the phrase that Joe uses, you can just call me. So you can just call me Joe. You can just call me Eli. You can use that language in your IELTS exam if the examiner asks you what you would like to be called. Let's continue.
Okay, Joe, in this first part, I'd like to ask you some questions about yourself. Let's talk about what you do. Do you work or are you a student?
I'm a full-time English teacher online.
And what do you like most about your work?
Probably the flexibility that it gives me. For example, anywhere that I bring my laptop and my webcam, it sort of turns into a bit of an office. So this allows me to work. I could work in a Starbucks, I could work from my home, but more importantly, I can even move where my home is, and I love that.
Is there anything you would like to change about your work?
Possibly the rate of pay. Unfortunately, teaching in general, you're never going to be a millionaire. The same is true for teaching online. I make more than enough money to be comfortable, but I think everybody would love a little bit more.
I asked Joe two very common questions. What do you like about your work? And what would you like to change about your work? Before your test, think about what you like and don't like about your work or studies. Joe likes the flexibility of being an online teacher, but he doesn't like the rate of pay. Joe also says, I make more than enough money to be comfortable, but I think everybody would love a little bit more. This is a great phrase. I make more than enough money to be comfortable, so he can live comfortably with his salary, but I think everybody would love a little bit more. He would still love to earn a little bit more, just like everyone else. Let's continue.
And let's move on. Let's talk about weekends. What do you usually do on weekends?
Actually, I have kind of an unusual weekend. I tend to work on Saturdays and Sundays, so my weekend is usually midweek. Allows me to be a little more productive. I can go to the bank or maybe go to a supermarket that is a little less busy at that time of week.
And would you say that the weekends are important to you?
Oh, definitely. It's important to have a good work-life balance. It's great to work and even if you love your job, but it's also very important to have time, whether that's to pursue a hobby that you really enjoy or if it's just to sit on the sofa and play games on your phone. It is quite important.
And do you prefer to plan your weekends or go with the flow?
A little bit of both, actually. There's certainly times that I have nothing really to do, and so maybe I just go for a walk and explore the city. However, there are other times that I might want to travel outside of the city to some quaint little village in the countryside and look at some traditional architecture, and so I need to find train schedules and what have you.
Okay, Joe said he has an unusual weekend. Did you hear why? He said, I tend to work on Saturdays and Sundays, so when most people are relaxing at the weekend, Joe is teaching. Now, tend to is great language for the IELTS speaking test. It means that Joe frequently or regularly works at the weekend. You can say, I tend to play badminton at the weekend, or I tend to go shopping at the weekend, or even I tend to lie in at the weekend, meaning you often stay in bed at the weekends. Joe also said it's important to have a good work-life balance. This is a great phrase for the IELTS test. If you have a good work-life balance, that means that you are able to balance your work commitments and also your leisure and family time. If you have a bad or a poor work-life balance, that means that you spend too much time working. Finally, Joe also said that sometimes he likes to travel outside the city to some quaint little village. Quaint means attractively unusual or old-fashioned. We often use it to describe small villages or houses. For example, in Scotland, where I live, there are lots of quaint little cottages in the countryside. By the way, that's a C2 level adjective, so band 8/9 vocabulary. Let's see what else we can learn from Joe.
Now let's move on. Let's talk about music. Do you like listening to music?
Yeah, from time to time, I guess. I
Hmm.
mean, generally, anytime I'm doing chores around the house, I like to have music on in the background. For example, every time I'm cooking, I'll crank Spotify onto a new music playlist just so I can hear what all the cool kids are listening to.
And what kinds of music do you usually like to listen to?
I think, like most people, it's probably a little varied. However, if I had to choose just one, I'd probably pick that sort of rock alternative, sort of early 90s music that was famous in America and Canada.
Is there a singer or a musician that you would like to see live in concert?
Not necessarily. Some of my favorite musicians are perhaps not these ones that have big shows. For instance, I like a group which is called Pearl Jam, and the musician generally just sits in his chair and plays his guitar. There aren't like fireworks and dance routines like you might have with, say, Taylor Swift or Katy Perry.
Mm.
Joe says he listens to music from time to time. If you do something from time to time, then you do something sometimes, but not regularly. So you can say, I go shopping from time to time. So that means you go shopping sometimes, but not regularly. Or you could say, I travel for work from time to time, or I go to the gym from time to time. Now, can you remember when Joe listens to music? He said he listens to music when he's doing chores. Chores are things like doing the laundry, washing the dishes, or my favourite, cleaning the bathroom. Now, do you remember I asked Joe what his favourite music was? Now, he gave me a great answer. He said, if I had to choose one, I'd probably pick rock music. For all of you grammar nerds, you'll know that this is the second conditional. If plus the past simple, then a comma, then would, and then an infinitive. This is great grammar to use when you have to make a tricky choice. So if the examiner asks, do you have a favorite dessert? You could say, if I had to choose one, I'd probably say cheesecake. Or if the examiner asks, do you have a best friend? You can say, if I had to choose one, I'd probably pick my friend Mark. And then explain why.
All right, we're going to move on to part 2. And in this part, I'm going to give you a topic and I'd like you to talk about it for 1 to 2 minutes. Before you talk, you'll have 1 minute to think about what you're going to say, and you can make some notes if you wish. Do you understand?
Yes, I do.
All right, remember you have 1 to 2 minutes for this, so don't worry if I stop you. I'll tell you when the time is up. Can you start speaking now, please?
Well, before I dive into the topic, I should probably mention that I'm not a very social person. I tend to spend a lot of my own time at home, generally sort of watching videos and perhaps playing video games. With that said, there have been a few parties or social gatherings that I've gone to over the years. And although it wasn't necessarily a party, I should probably mention a friend of mine, Ed, who I met when I was in Japan. As I mentioned, it wasn't really a celebration, so to speak, but it was more like a weekly gathering of English teachers who happened to work in a particular town that I was living in. And so every week on, I think it was a Monday or Tuesday, it was during the week, we would meet in a bar and where they had like darts and pool and typical sort of bar room activities. So this one time that I went, there was a new guy who I'd never really seen before. I was looking for a darts partner. And so I simply asked, "Hey, man, do you want to play a little bit of darts here?" And so that automatically then sort of puts you in a group of two, and it isolated us from the other people that were at that sort of particular gathering. It was quite easy to sort of strike up a conversation. At first, it was more just about the work. What is English, what is teaching like? And then we started talking a little more about Japan. How do you like living here in Japan? And eventually, it ended up to talk about video games. Both of us quite enjoyed it, so we were talking about the latest releases, and eventually we made a bit of a date, so to speak, to sort of play a particular game that was more of a collaborative one, which we could play as a group. I think overall it was an unusual step for me to sort of strike up a conversation. With that said, I'm quite happy that it ended in what has turned out to be a lifelong relationship.
Thank you. And so do you think you will spend more time with this friend in the future?
I would certainly love to. Unfortunately, now he lives in Australia and I'm here in Budapest, so it's difficult for us to get together.
Do you remember how Joe started talking about the topic? He said, before I dive into the topic, I should probably mention that I'm not a very social person. This is a brilliant phrase to give the examiner a bit of context about the topic you're going to talk about. Before I dive into the topic, I should probably mention. So for example, if you get a topic asking you about a character in a film, you could say, before I dive into the topic, I should probably mention that I don't watch that many films and I've got an awful memory for actors. Or if you get a topic about an interesting old person, you can say, before I dive into the topic, I should probably mention that I don't really know that many old people. Most of the people I know are my age. He also used a great idiom that I want to point out. He said, it was quite easy to strike up a conversation. To strike up a conversation means to start a conversation with someone that you've never met before. So if you're waiting at a bus stop and the bus doesn't come, you can strike up a conversation with someone that is also waiting. Let's see how his part 3 is.
All right. So we've been talking about someone who you met and enjoyed talking to at a party, and I'd like to discuss with you 1 or 2 more general questions related to this. Let's consider, first of all, how people make friends. Now, you said that you're not really the most sociable person, but in general, how can people make new friends?
With this sort of technological revolution that we're in, I think it's become increasingly easy for people such as myself who maybe find it difficult to talk to a stranger, as you have groups which are organized online through apps like Meetup or what have you. There's also sort of dating websites that I think are becoming increasingly popular. It's that initial step, I think, that most people are afraid of, and I think technology has taken the fear out of that.
What do you think is the kind of the main difference between meeting somebody in person for the first time and meeting somebody online for the first time?
Well, you already have a small insight into them when they're online. If it's some sort of profile, then they've said, "Hey, I really like dogs," or "I enjoy traveling," and so it allows you to immediately step into, "Oh, I heard you like traveling," and it gives you that commonality. Whereas if you're just in some bar or randomly at a party, you have no idea what the person's like, nor what they're interested in. So finding that initial sort of what you might have in common takes a little bit more finesse and effort.
And how do you think making new friends and how we make new friends will change in the future?
It's quite difficult to predict the future. One
Mm,
possible way will be that it's an entirely digital atmosphere. So not only do you meet the person and eventually meet in real life, but I think virtual reality could be that we don't even meet our physical being,
mm,
but perhaps some avatar that we've created in a digital space.
mm.
But I mean, really, who knows?
Do you think that'll be a good thing?
Well, there are pros and cons to everything. I think it will allow people to sort of get out of their day to day isolation and make it a little bit easier. However, humans are social beings, and part of why we've developed our societies and our culture and our communities is by how we directly interact with each other. So missing out on that, I think it might affect us in some negative ways.
If any of you have done the IELTS test before, you'll know how common it is for the examiner to ask you about the future. I asked Joe, how do you think people will make friends in the future? Now he said, it's quite difficult to predict the future. One possible way will be, this is a great phrase that you can use in your IELTS speaking. It's quite difficult to predict the future. One possible way will be, just try not to use it too often, otherwise the examiner might think that you've memorized it for the test. Now, when Joe talked about how we might make friends in the future through virtual reality, I asked another very typical question. I asked, do you think that this will be a good thing? Examiners often encourage you to make judgments about things being good or bad. You can say what Joe said. Well, there are pros and cons to everything. And then make sure to expand on what those pros and cons are. Let's get back to listening to Joe.
Let's move on. Let's talk a bit more about close friendship and acquaintances. Now, do you think there's much of a difference between being close friends and just being somebody's acquaintance?
Oh, almost certainly.
Mhm.
So when somebody's an acquaintance, this might just be a person who you might meet to do some superficial activities. Hey, let's go for a coffee, or let's visit a museum. The big difference comes with a good friend who is more of a confidant. This is someone who you might trust with perhaps some secrets. This is someone who you can rely on if you need to move homes.
Mm.
So I think a bit of a balance of the both helps to create a more full-fledged and well-rounded social experience.
And some people have the same friends throughout their entire life. So they have childhood friends that go on to continue to be their best friends later in life. Why do you think that is so common?
I'm not sure. I think that it's common. I think nowadays, as people, regardless of the country, we tend to migrate towards bigger cities for job opportunities. And so we leave our hometowns a lot more than we used to.
Mm,
Increasingly, we're even going internationally to work for international companies.
mm.
So while there are certainly people who will have friends from high school or middle school or even longer, more and more it seems that we surround ourselves with whoever's available at that time and have a few sort of staples, which sort of help us to transition from place to place.
Do you think there's a difference between making friends in your home country compared to making friends from new cultures or new countries?
Oh, there's no question.
Yeah.
One is going to be the language barrier. Obviously, if someone speaks English, my second languages are really quite low level. So being able to speak English to someone is a big step, and most people in Canada do speak English. Furthermore, there are some cultural traits that we might not be familiar with. For example, if you were to go to the Middle East, it's maybe not as appropriate to talk to a single woman, whereas in other countries that might be a little more open. And sometimes you're just not aware of what you should or should not do, and it can cause an awkward situation.
Okay, thank you very much. That is the end of the speaking test.
What an impressive speaking test. There are lots of teachers like Joe on italki. Remember, the link is in the description and make sure to use the code PRO5 to get $5 free learning credit when you spend your first $10. Now, after the speaking test, Joe shares some of his top tips for the IELTS test. So if you're interested, keep watching.
Thank you.
Wow, that was incredible, Joe. That was absolutely brilliant.
You say that to everybody. Oh, shut up. You're just silly. Whatever.
Well, that was very impressive, and I was wondering if I can ask you, because I know you're an extremely experienced IELTS teacher and also IELTS examiner, and I was wondering if you could tell me some of the things that were going through your head and going when you were doing the test. So some of the tips that you were giving yourself, or the things that you were consciously doing or not doing.
Um, no question. Arguably, the single most important thing that I think you can do on the speaking test is to ask yourself why. This it might seem like a simple question, but this allows you to expand your answer and to always give more and more specific details.
Mm,
If we speak generally, you're always going to use general vocabulary. However, if we're giving specific examples and giving specific reasons, you're speaking specifically. And this allows you to use better and better words.
mm,
This is reflected in the way that part one happens. If in the event your answer in part one is extremely short and the examiner feels it's maybe not adequate, we're only allowed to ask why and why not.
mm,
So if that's part of the examiner's script, then why bother to wait for the examiner to say so? Just answer it yourself. So every step that I made, I always ask myself, why do I do that? Why am I antisocial? Or why was it easy to talk to this person? Or why do I think that relationships and the way we form these relationships are going to change? So that's probably the biggest tip.
mm. So were you doing that through part one, part two, and part three?
Oh, throughout, yeah. It's always a big step to go any part of the exam. I think it helps you to develop what we call developing your responses.
Mm,
Now, this sort of terminology really only occurs at band 8 and band 9, where we talk about developing appropriately and coherently. However, if you want those higher scores, you need to articulate exactly what it is you think and why you think that.
mm,
Not only that, I think one thing that I do while I speak is I'm not trying to win a competition. I'm not just speaking to have my mouth move. And so I think what I do a lot is I take sort of a half a second pause, which is not necessarily a hesitation. I'm not looking for the right word or the right grammar, but I want to make sure that I'm saying exactly what I think. So taking that half moment of reflection, like I did just then, can sometimes help you to slow down, and it also helps the person to listen to you as well.
I noticed that you did that especially well in part two. I really felt involved in your story, and I wasn't so much listening to the vocabulary and grammar so much as being involved in your story and wanting to hear about how the relationship with this friend in Japan expanded and became closer.
Well, the way that I view the exam is that's what it is. It's kind of a story. Now, in part one, you might only have maybe a 3 sentence answer. I mean, there's no magical number. It's not like you have to use three. Just answer the question until it's finished, sort of thing. But if we were to use three, that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's basically a very short, very simple story, but
Mm.
it has that progression where you're giving reasons and examples. So it's generally a very good tip, particularly for higher level candidates, as
Mm.
that's exactly what the band descriptor kind of wants you to do.
Yes. And then in part three, so I mean, I knew that you'd be getting way beyond band seven. This would be a very strong band nine IELTS speaking test. And so I was deliberately trying to ask you maybe slightly more abstract questions. What advice would you give to students that are getting very difficult questions in part three of the test?
So, so there's one of two pieces that I would offer. One, you don't have to say yes.
Right.
I think one of the questions you said is I don't recall exactly, but it was
It was about
something
developing
where
close relationships and childhood friends, and then you didn't agree. I thought
so
it was great.
exactly. So a lot of people sort of get trapped into this automatic sort of yes answer, and then they don't know what to say because they don't actually agree.
Mhm.
So in that example, I disagree. I
Mhm.
don't think that that's true, and that's perfectly fine. There's no rule that says you have to agree with everything on the IELTS, and so saying what you actually feel, I think, is a very big step. Um, uh, but I think perhaps even more than that, you also don't have to be smart, right? It's not a matter of intelligence. It's not a test of knowledge, it's a test of English. So
Mm,
even if you don't know something, if you genuinely have no opinion, what are the negative effects of mass tourism?
mm,
I don't know. I don't know. And
hmm,
that's fine to say you don't know, but explain that you don't know. To be honest, I'm from some small town where we've never really had any tourists, so I have no real knowledge of how it might affect that particular area. That's fine. Say you
mm,
don't know, but explain why. And that's what gets harder with these part three questions that do get more abstract, and you might not have ever thought about it even in your own language.
mm.
So you don't have to say yes, and you don't even have to have a real opinion.
Do you think there's a way that students can practice that skill before they go on to do their IELTS speaking test?
There's certainly many people who try to look at the active question banks, although technically it's kind of against the rules, but it is what it is. And they try to remember answers to particular questions. I'm not sure that's the right approach. Instead, look at generally what are the most common topics that come up and try to think to yourself, what do I think about that? What's your favorite color? Blue. Why? Why do you like blue? Who's your favorite singer? Justin Bieber. Well, it's not, but anyway. Why? Like he's got a good tempo and rhythm. His lyrics are catchy, and so taking the IELTS is going to often force you to think about topics and ideas which you probably never thought about in your own life.
Mm,
So you need to have it. Need to have an opinion. You need to have some sort of idea. So going through some question banks, random websites, this is a great YouTube channel to be able to introduce some of these common topics
mm.
and develop your own ideas. It can be a struggle, but that's what band eights and band nines kind of need.
Yeah, I love that. In one of my lessons, I've suggested that students can literally just be together. One student asks a question, the other one answers, and when the student who answers finishes, the other student who's asking the questions just asks why and gets them to elaborate on it. And I think that's exactly what you're saying, except go that one step further and just do it in your head in order to show the examiner that you can elaborate on all of your answers.
I do think it's important that in our preparation, yeah, it would be amazing if you had like a private tutor while you're living in a native English speaking country who's the reality is that that's not always what we have. So you need to use whatever opportunities and facilities that you do have immediately available.
Mm.
Perhaps a study buddy who is looking at doing the exam, or even just someone who's willing to suffer through it.
Mhm.
Not to mention that, mobile phones are your best friend, man. Uh, we are terrible witnesses for what we say. And this is often when you get into an argument. Well, I didn't say that. I didn't. Yes, you did. You just don't remember it. So having a recorded device and to be able to review what you're actually seeing saying is a very useful tool. But not only should you listen to what you're saying, but transcribing and writing down what you say will help you to then visualize that language.
Mm.
And while it's written, why not make it a little bit better? Oh, I didn't use enough linking words. Oh, I could have said, for example, here, or could have said besides there. Or, I said the word friend 22 times. Is there a different word for friend? Go to a
Mm.
thesaurus and find that word. So use whatever opportunities you have. If you're by yourself and you're in your dorm room in whatever country, use the technology. They're very useful tools and they're there to help us.
And tell me, when a student comes to you and they're looking for help with their IELTS, how do you change your lessons or how do you organize your lessons to help students?
So everybody, while there are some common issues that you're going to have on the exam, particularly some of the more unusual criteria,
Mm.
which revolve around, like connectives and discourse markers, which is maybe not part of natural speech,
Mhm.
paraphrasing, which is maybe not what we naturally do. So
Mm.
it is quite important to sort of point out, hey, here are these weird criteria.
Mm.
And so making people aware of what the rules of the exam are is very important. According to the 2022 statistics reported by IELTS, roughly 20% of self prescribed native speakers are able to get above a band 8. It's not because they don't know the language. We're native speakers. We should have some control of our language,
Mhm.
but it's whether or not you're meeting the rules of the exam. It would be unrealistic to just pick up a basketball and start playing without knowing that you need to dribble first. The
Mm.
same is true for the IELTS, and being familiar with the band descriptor is important. With that
Mm.
said, once you're familiar with the rules, it then becomes a matter of language acquisition. Simple steps like we need to hear less common vocabulary at band 7 and above. So stop saying words like interesting.
Mm.
Why not say fascinating or
Mm.
engaging?
Mm.
Don't say the word cold, like go to the next level, say freezing.
Mm.
So these small changes and making people aware of what they can do with their own language is quite important.
Mm.
But without question, the number one rule of the speaking test is the speaking test is a speaking test. And you need to provide the examiner with a sample of your language so that we can properly assess you. As a native speaker, I commonly use one sentence answers. At times, I don't even use words. If I go to a restaurant, I might just point to the menu and be like, uh. However, that would be inappropriate for the exam. So just having people to be aware that, yes, I need to sometimes explain why, or yes, I need to give an example is unquestionably one of the biggest problems that people have while doing the test.
So I imagine a lot of my students on YouTube will be watching this video and thinking, I'd like to do a lesson with Joe in the future. And so they can find the link to you in the description of this video. And then what would they get from doing a lesson with you? Would they be doing practice speaking tests? Would you be giving them material? Would you be asking them one question and they answer and then you provide an example? Or how do you format your lessons?
So the first step is we need to know what your problems are. So if you were to if you want to focus on speaking, then our first lesson will always be a mock test. And we start like right out the gate. Hi, my name's Joe. Let's start the test.
Right.
So I
Right.
don't give any tips. I don't give any suggestions. I need to see how that person would do on the exam. Then, based on that performance, we go through the band criteria. We identify, oh, well, you maybe didn't use, you kept saying the word because. So
Mm.
that's a very repetitive grammatical structure. Or you kept saying the word interesting. So you don't really have that range of vocabulary. Or you
Mm.
didn't necessarily explain yourself. So you don't have this willingness to speak at length. Once we've identified those issues, then further lessons will then sort of have a more like we present what we should be doing with maybe some examples.
Mhm.
We then do some controlled practice where it might just be a quick little question answer. And then by the end, it's a lot more of an exam style situation where I would ask like part one or part three or part two questions so that they have that practice. There's a
Mhm.
similar sort of format if we were to look at the writing. So the very first writing lesson, you would have to send me a sample of your task one and your task two. And very similarly, we would discuss during the lesson what are some of the strengths, what are some of the weaknesses. I don't just do error correction like, oh, you didn't use the present perfect, you should have used the past simple. It's not as useful. Pointing out that it's a mistake is usually enough. To say, hey, you've got this many mistakes, but let's look at your organization. Do you have a
Mhm.
beginning, a middle, and an end? Have you connected your ideas together? Once we've identified the problems in the writing, then similarly, we might look at, for example, how to write a paragraph with a
Mhm.
present, extend, support sort of structure, which they mention in the criteria.
Mhm.
Then we might talk about how to connect those together with sort of linking words, for example. We might look at introductions and conclusions if that's your problem. Or task one for the academic, writing a good, clear overview is kind of hard. It's more of a
Sure.
math question than it is an English question. So helping people to identify, oh, wow, look at that thing. I should probably mention that one special thing.
Mm.
It seems obvious once you explain it, but if no one's ever told you that, then it can be difficult to identify the key features and the main points, which are in task one.
Mm. So are you teaching all of the skills then? Speaking, writing, reading, listening?
Yes and no. So overwhelmingly, I tend to focus on the productive skills, so the speaking and the writing.
Mhm.
That's because this is something that's very difficult for you to get feedback on, and it's almost impossible for you to assess yourself.
Yeah.
Now, I do run a reading lesson and a listening lesson, but only like one of those each.
Mhm.
Because there are plenty of good resources there. For example, the IELTS books, which are published by Cambridge, are the old exams, and each one of those books has four, speakings, four writings, but more importantly, four listenings and four readings. And so you can sort of look at the end, and you can see what your answers are. You can see how many you got right or wrong, and you can self-assess. Oh, I got 30 out of 40. I'm a band 7. I don't really need help.
Mm.
And so I think it's much more useful to maybe practice those in your own time. I can give you some tips and suggestions,
Mm.
but it might be a better investment of your money and your time to focus on those things that you can't really practice by yourself, which are the speaking and the writing.
And would you recommend that a student gets in contact with you a long time before they actually have their IELTS test?
Yes and no. So one is just the practical matters. So even though I teach up to 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, my schedule does tend to book out quite quickly,
Yeah.
and up to a week in advance. And so if you're just looking at doing something the day before your exam, chances are availability, not just for mine, but for many other teachers on italki, just might not be there.
Mm.
More importantly, though, any advice or any suggestions that we might have to help you to improve, they're
Mm.
going to be two different types of ones. Ones you can do fairly quickly, and ones that might take weeks or months or even years of practice.
Yeah.
However, even if it is a quick and simple idea, like use a couple more linking words, you won't be able to do that by the next day. It's
Mm.
still going to take a day or two of practice, some self awareness. So it is ineffective to maybe start IELTS exams like 2 years in advance when you're only like a band 5 speaker and you're hoping for a band 8, because that's more about learning language.
Mm.
Alternatively, it's not really a good idea to do some lessons the day before your exam because there's no real improvements that you can do. So somewhere in the middle is going to be that sweet spot. Maybe a couple weeks, maybe a month, maybe 2 or 3 months.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think that's how most teachers would work, especially on italki.
Okay, great. Right, Joe, thank you very much for coming on, for doing this speaking test with me. I can't wait to edit this video, put up all the amazing vocabulary into the top of the screen and on the subtitles as well. And yeah, thanks a lot for sharing all of your great advice and tips for the IELTS learners.
Well, thank you very much for running this YouTube channel. I think it's important for people to have good resources where there's, quality advice, suggestions, and more importantly, examples. And so the more sources we have where people like your YouTube channel or perhaps, learning platforms like italki is definitely going to help people to achieve their goals and their dreams. So thank you.
Great stuff. Thanks for watching to the end. Remember, in the description there's a link to italki where you'll find hundreds of language tutors just like Joe who can help you on your journey to become better English speakers. As always, best of luck with your IELTS preparation and I'll see you in the next lesson. Bye then.